Okay there, welcome to you all for this revision video, which is focused on the topic of peacemaking from the AQA GCSE History, Conflict and Tension course, 1918 to 1939. In this video, we're going to talk about the impact of the Treaty of Versailles, and we're going to look at the wider settlement as well. So we're going to touch on things like the Treaty of Saint-Germain, Trianon, Neuilly and Sèvres, and also we're going to talk a little bit about the Treaty of Lausanne as well. And we're going to look at how the Allies reacted to the peace treaties, why Germany objected to it. We're going to look at what the strengths and weaknesses of the settlements were, including any problems that were created by these peace settlements. So without further ado, let's go. So let's look at the Treaty of Versailles first of all. So we've already talked about the Treaty of Versailles, signed on 28th of June 1919. It was a dictated peace, a diktat. And we already talked about the big three, about David Lloyd George, about George Clemenceau, about Woodrow Wilson. And we just really want to think about how people generally react to the Treaty of Versailles. So Britain, first of all. So Britain has fought in the First World War. Many soldiers were killed or injured in the First World War, but no real actual fighting in Britain in the First World War. A little bit of bombing on the East Coast, but primarily this was a war that was fought within France and Belgium. However, most people in Britain wanted to see Germany punished in 1919. Lloyd George had promised in the election campaign in 1918 to make Germany pay. But there were some very significant opponents to the Treaty of Versailles. And the one person I really want to draw your attention to is John Maynard Keynes. Now, John Maynard Keynes was a very famous economist. So that meant he was an expert on things to do with money and trade and how economies in different countries worked. And he wrote a best-selling book at the time, and it was called The Economic Consequence of the Peace. And he basically argued that the Treaty of Versailles was all wrong in that it was all based around revenge and punishment, and actually the emphasis of the peacemakers at Versailles should have been about rebuilding Europe after the war. Now, this was a very significant book. It sold around 100,000 copies and actually very popular in Germany as well. And it turned British public opinion eventually against the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this is very significant because what this meant is that when we get to the 1930s and we get people like Hitler pushing back against the Treaty of Versailles and breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, you've now got a British public that are more sympathetic to that stance. And therefore, the consequence of this, that it makes appeasement a much more likely British policy. To the Archbishop of Canterbury, he said he was, quote, very uncomfortable with the treaty. And over time, the mood of the British public shifts to being one that is about, yeah, let's get revenge and a harsh punishment in 1919 to much more understanding and much more sympathy towards Germany and much more of a focus on doing anything you can to avoid a war. So, you know, ideas like pacifism increased quite a lot in Britain in the interwar period. So that's significant for you to be aware of. Now, let's have a look at France. So many people in France, bearing in mind that most of the war has been fought in France and a great deal of damage has been done, you know, in that northern and eastern part of France. Many people in France are happy. They feel that Clemenceau has improved French security, getting things like the Rhineland demilitarized, getting Alsace-Lorraine back, for example, getting the reparations. But remember, Clemenceau was asking for £44 billion worth of reparations, and the actual figure came in at £6.6 billion. So that's quite a big climb down. Now, Clemenceau himself was frustrated that he wasn't able to get everything that he wanted. He wanted the Rhineland to be an independent country, for example. He felt that Germany was giving way too many soldiers, 100,000 he thought was way too many. And he actually lost the French presidential election in early 1920. So quite a few issues there with France. America, Wilson was pleased about elements of the Treaty of Versailles. He's very pleased about the League of Nations being set up. That was one of his big ideas. But most people in the USA were hostile to the treaty. They felt that Britain and France had had too much of their way at the Treaty of Versailles. They felt that Britain and France were gaining. They were gaining too much power within Europe, and they were gaining control of Germany's colonies, for example, and they were becoming too powerful. And many people in America argued that Wilson's ideas from his 14 points, his idealistic ideas of self-determination, they felt that those ideas were sacrificed in order to support the interests of Britain and France. And therefore, Congress in the USA rejected the Treaty of Versailles. It was the American Senate, actually, that rejected the Treaty of Versailles. And America never joined the League of Nations, and the USA embarks on what's called an isolationist foreign policy. So it's not much of a surprise that Germany disliked the Treaty of Versailles, and we'll start off just by looking at this cartoon published in 1919. A very famous cartoon, this, and it shows a very poor family, and the German mother is saying to her starving child, quote, "When we have paid 100 billion marks, then I can give you something to eat." And it's very much giving us the viewpoint that Germany was already poor at the end of the First World War, and then it was being harshly punished, had 13% of its land taken away, 26% of its coal resources taken away from it, losing some really important areas of land, for example, and then having to pay reparations as well. Now, Germany had been set up to believe that the peace treaties would not be too harsh. For example, that the peace treaties would be based on Wilson's 14 points. Germany was now a democracy. It was a new republic, a Weimar Republic, and it was a very, very different country to the country that had been run by Kaiser Wilhelm II. So Germany didn't expect the treaty to be so harsh. So when it was, that was a real shock to the German people. People in Germany argued that Germany couldn't defend itself. But really, what was a really key aspect for Germany was that the peace was dictated to Germany. It was a diktat. They didn't have any say. This treaty was presented to them as a kind of like a take it or leave it type offer, and if you don't sign it, we're gonna restart the war against you and occupy Germany as a country. And Germany, of course, is in absolutely no position to fight a war in June 1919. So what this does is it leads to the idea of the November criminals and the idea of the stab in the back myth. And this myth, which is completely incorrect, but really gets real traction, I think, during the Weimar Republic, this idea that Germany wasn't properly defeated in the First World War. And I really like this fact that flags flew at half-mast across the country. This was a country in mourning for the powerful and proud nation that Germany had been, and many people in Germany felt humiliated. And this was how Germany began. Under the time of the Weimar Republic, and this would create huge problems eventually, because this whole narrative, this whole idea about a November criminals and the stab in the back myth would allow people like Hitler, for example, to making their promises to make Germany a strong and powerful country again, and that would appeal to many people who would then give their votes to political groups like that. So it's really important that you know that the Treaty of Versailles is just one of 5 treaties that are signed. Now, all of these peace treaties are named after suburbs and areas, districts really, of Paris. So there is the Treaty of Saint-Germain that deals with Austria, signed on the 10th of September 1919. The Treaty of Neuilly, which deals with Bulgaria, signed on the 27th of November 1919. The Treaty of Trianon, which deals with Hungary, signed on the 4th of June 1920. And then the Treaty of Sèvres, signed on the 10th of August 1920. Now, in Turkey, they actually rebel against the peace treaty, and therefore they renegotiate the treaty and sign a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, sort of named after Lausanne in Switzerland, in July 1923. Now, if you look at that map, one of the key aspects of these peace treaties, and all the peace treaties, including the Treaty of Versailles, is that they transform the map of Europe and they create new countries. So new countries like Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary that are created out of the ashes of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. The country of Yugoslavia is created in the Balkans, and that's really significant. Of course, that will last as a country up until the 1990s. You've got Poland, newly independent, Finland, newly independent from Russia. You've got Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, also newly independent countries from the old Russian Empire. So you seen a breakup here of different empires, large empires that existed before the First World War, like the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course the Ottoman Empire as well. So this creates this whole series of new countries, and this has profound consequences, because within some of these new countries like Austria and like Czechoslovakia, and of course later on Poland, these are the countries that are susceptible and fall vulnerable to invasion by Germany, and of course Russia involved in attacking the east of Poland in 1939 as well. So this sows the seeds for some of the conflicts and disruption that will come in terms of international relations into the 1930s. So let's have a look at the other treaties that are signed and let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. So the Treaty of Saint-Germain signed with Austria. Austria loses a bit of land to Italy and Romania. Only 30,000 in the army, and of course the banning of the Anschluss is in the Treaty of Saint-Germain as well, of course, as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, reparations are never paid by Austria because the Austrian economy collapses in 1920 and 1921. So the reparations never end up getting paid. And I think what that event shows, is the vulnerability of the new country of Austria. And Austria is plagued with quite a few problems. And if you think ahead into other aspects of the course, you'll find out about, like, the Dollfuss affair in 1934. Hitler tries to take over Austria quite quickly after he becomes the leader of Germany in 1933. Now, then there's the Treaty of Neuilly that deals with Bulgaria. So reparations are set at 100 million. They're only allowed 20,000 in the army. They lost land, but then they gained a little bit of land from Turkey as well. Similarly, the Treaty of Trianon, Hungary, 4th of June 1920, that's signed. Lost land to Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Austria. Reparations are set, but similar to Austria, they're never paid because the Hungarian economy also collapsed after World War I, and they're only allowed 30,000 in their army. And then finally, the Treaty of Sèvres. So Turkey lost all of its European land, except for a small area around Constantinople. Their Ottoman Empire, which was the empire based around Turkey, that's split up. The Turkish army is restricted to 50,000. The Turkey lost their control over the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And these were very important trading links, waterways that link the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Now then, if you look at the Treaty of Sèvres, there's outrage about that treaty, and people in Turkey are extremely angry, and there's protests about it, and it leads to a renegotiation of the peace treaty, and it leads to something called the Treaty of Lausanne. Now, this is highly significant, but let's just think about what the Treaty of Lausanne is, first of all. So it's signed in 1923, and Turkey regained some of the land that Greece had actually taken from them. They also gained control of the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits. Now, you can see there where the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits are. They're really, really important waterways that link the Mediterranean Sea into the Black Sea, so they're crucial for trading. And they also regained the right to decide how big their armed forces were. The reparations were cancelled, and the Allied troops that were stationed in Turkey were withdrawn. So it's a huge, huge diplomatic victory, this, for Turkey. And it's highly, highly significant in terms of international relations. And I think what it proves is that if a country will stand up against the peace treaties, that the treaties were actually unenforceable. And I think what it shows is that, you know, when a country decided to challenge the peace treaties, unless the allies and countries within the League of Nations were prepared to fight to enforce the treaties were unenforceable. And of course, you know, we see that with the Treaty of Versailles and Germany in the 1930s. So this is your first taste, really, of a country saying, do you know what, we're not going to abide by that peace treaty, we don't like it, and we're not going to follow it. And it obviously gives the idea, and again, it reinforces this idea to more powerful countries that if you stand up to the League of Nations and you stand up to the Allies in the 1920s and 1930s, they're probably going to appease you rather than actually fight against you. So the British agreed to renegotiate the Treaty of Sèvres, and it basically is almost like a recognition that the other peace treaties are perhaps unfair. And again, I suppose when you think about what happened in the 1930s with Japan invading Manchuria and Italy invading Abyssinia, just gives that idea that if you are brave enough and you are powerful enough, you can basically use aggression to get your own way in this time period. So let's have a look at how successful the peace treaties are overall. So I think this is an important thing for you to be aware of. So firstly, it's a complex situation. You're seeing the decline of some large empires at the end of the First World War, the collapse of the German Empire, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the collapse of Turkey's Ottoman Empire, and the collapse of the Russian Empire as well. So out of the ashes of these empires springs new countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Finland, newly independent, and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, and Yugoslavia, for example. So in terms of successes, well, there is peace in Europe in the 1920s, and the League of Nations is a new idea, it's an innovative idea, and the idea that diplomacy and talking things through and discussion can solve international disputes, it's a great idea, and it certainly seems to be a good idea on paper, there's no doubt about that. And there are some examples, as we'll see in future videos, about how the League of Nations does solve disputes, like in the Ireland Islands, for example. And these new states are initially successful. Czechoslovakia is a good example. a very successful state in the 1920s and early 1930s. It's got some good industry in there. It's quite a powerful country. It's quite successful. But some examples of how the peace treaties are unsuccessful. Broadly, although we talked about how there's some elements of success in the 1920s, these new countries are difficult to rule. So if we take Czechoslovakia as an example, potentially, a really powerful country. However, there are 3 million German-speaking people living in an area called Sudetenland, and that's going to create problems in the future, most noticeably when obviously Germany in 1938 says that it wants to take control of those German-speaking people. What's also unsuccessful about the peace treaty is it creates a lot of anger and resentment. So in Germany, that resentment and anger and the idea of a stab in the back myth led to a rise in the Nazi Party. Italians also very angry that they did not gain much from their involvement in the First World War. 700,000 Italians died fighting in the war. The Italians weren't part of the key decision making at Versailles. They're not one of the big three, and they don't really gain a lot themselves from the peace agreements. So therefore, we see Italy trying to increase its power in the 1920s and 1930s. We see that when Italy invades Corfu in 1923. We see it in the invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. We see it in the rise to power of Benito Mussolini after his march on Rome in 1922. Poland, very vulnerable to attack, no natural defences, no big mountains or rivers that can protect it naturally, so that becomes vulnerable to attack, and of course it is attacked in September 1939 by both Germany and the Soviet Union as it is then. What happens with Turkey, I think, is a really strong example for the peace treaties being unsuccessful. The fact that they're able to renegotiate that leads to tension with Greece. And also some of these new countries like Austria, but also Hungary as well, their economies collapsed in the 1920s. So that creates problems as well. So overall, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It was a tough job, but they made these peace treaties very, very quickly, and there were lots and lots of mistakes that were made. And we know there was lots of commentators at the time, people like David Lloyd George, people like Marshal Ferdinand Foch, for example, in France, that were saying that these peace treaties would sow the seeds of a future conflict. And it's certainly, the failure of these peace treaties is certainly a key factor for why World War II broke out in 1939. So overall, that was a GCSE history video focusing on the reactions to the Paris peace settlements and looking at the Treaty of Versailles and the other peace treaties that were signed at the end of the First World War, dealing with Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and see you next time.